Well, good evening. It is, as was announced, Q&A night, though not the official Q&A night. It's supposed to be next Sunday night, but I'll be doing some traveling this week, headed to Texas for the Young Preacher Workshop that I attend every year. And so I would ask for your prayers. I always forget to write my own announcements on the announcement sheet. Forgot to write that one down. I'm leaving Wednesday, so Lord willing, I'll be in Texas on Wednesday through Saturday. But there's something else going on Sunday night as a part of our services. And I'll just let that be a surprise for you all. But it gives me a break as well to not need to preach when I come back on the following Sunday. So please pray for that trip. Q&A night. 3 questions tonight. And again, let me say just how much I appreciate your questions. Mainly, I appreciate the heart behind your questions. Because when you ask questions, I understand some of them are more curiosity, like I'm just wondering about this. But probably for the majority of questions that I receive from you all, there is a sincere heart of wanting to know the truth about how to obey God and how to put His Word into practice in everyday life. And that's what I find, especially with these 3 questions that we have tonight. The first one being, can Christians take yoga class? Now, sometimes you look at a question, you think, well, why would somebody even really need to ask that? But it makes perfect sense when you consider some background. Consider that yoga is rooted in Hinduism. The word yoga means to unite. And on the Hindu American Foundation's website, there's a quote from a Hindu guru, and guru just means teacher, that says the essence of yoga is to reach oneness with God. Now, that may seem like a good thing at first, except the God they're talking about is not the God of the Bible. Hindus believe in a multitude of gods, 330 million gods, but all of these gods are also a part of a larger, ultimate God, the ultimate supreme being. And what's interesting is that they believe that supreme being is within each of us. That our souls, the deepest part of ourselves, are actually a part of this supreme divine being. So the more we come to know ourselves, the more we connect with our bodies, the more we connect with divinity and reach oneness with what they would call Brahman, which is this ultimate reality, this ultimate supreme being. Now, take a break from that for a moment and just think with me about yoga from a physical perspective. Just nothing religious, just think about it physically with me for a moment. In life, we get really busy, and our minds are going 100 miles an hour, and our bodies many times are going 100 miles an hour to keep up with our minds, to keep up with all the tasks that we have to do. And so many times our bodies are just on autopilot. We do a lot of things that we don't even have to think about because we're just moving from one task, one routine task to another. So our mind and our body sometimes don't even have to work together. They can be separated. When we watch television, and a lot of mindless TV, what Adam was referring to this morning, it actually separates your mind from your body because you're watching what's going on in TV, but you're not really in the moment of what's going on here. You're taken somewhere else into a journey on that screen. Now, as you do yoga, your mind becomes totally focused on what's going on in your body. As you form those postures, you can actually feel all of the muscles that are twitching in order to stabilize your body. You can feel the air moving in and out of your lungs as they expand and contract. You feel the little beads of sweat rolling across your forehead. You hear your breath in and out. Your physical senses are all engaged. And when you do yoga, you might say you're in the moment. Completely in the moment. You are aware of every little thing going on in your body, but here's the interesting thing. The more you do yoga, the less you have to think while you do it. And so ironically, you can be totally focused and in the moment with your body, but completely clear and not thinking about anything in your mind. That's why yoga is a great stress reliever. and lowers blood pressure because you're actually exercising and relaxing at the same time. From a strictly physical perspective, it's a pretty fascinating experience. However, Hindus believe that when you are in the moment, when you can actually clear your mind like that, that's when you're most connected to the supreme being within yourself. And when you become really advanced in your ability to clear your mind, to become completely one and united in your mind and body, but then allow your mind to just be clear, that's when you can reach a state they call moksha. Moksha is a state of freedom or liberation from the cycle of rebirth. You see, Hindus believe when we die, we are reborn again on the earth in a second life, and it just depends on whatever life we live the first time, that karma will come back around to you, and now you're reborn with a different life. And it's a cycle that's endless. Well, if you reach a state of moksha where you can set your mind completely free from your body, you can actually be set free from the cycle of rebirth. You won't have to be reborn anymore on the earth over and over again, and your soul can finally just be free and at rest. This is what they teach. The same Hindu guru I quoted earlier said this: using yoga for physical practice is no good, of no use, just a lot of sweating, pushing, and heavy breathing for nothing. The spiritual aspect, which is beyond the physical, is the purpose of yoga. When the nervous system is purified, when your mind rests in the self, then you can experience the true greatness of yoga. This is why even if you take yoga class today, you'll hear a lot of Hindu language like namaste, which means the light in me bows to the light in you, or sun salutations, which is somewhat of a worship posture to the sun, or you'll do ohms, which is a word that refers to the uniting of self with the supreme being of the universe. So can Christians take yoga classes? Well, the answer depends. It depends. There are striking similarities between this question and the questions that the Christians in the first century had about eating meat sacrificed to idols. And so let me use Scripture to show you 4 conditions that must be met in order for it to be okay to take yoga class. And we'll start with the most obvious first. You can't do it as religious devotion to Hindu gods or any other false gods. Hopefully you already know that. But let's talk about it. Look in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And just to set up a little bit of a background here, in the first century world, people would offer animal sacrifices to their false gods. And then as a part of the worship of those false gods, they would eat from those animals, the parts that they didn't sacrifice. They would eat from those animals together in temples devoted to those idols. Eating that meat that they had just sacrificed to their false god was a way of communing with that god, a way of having fellowship with that god. Well, the Corinthian Christians argued, look, it's perfectly fine for us to eat that meat in the idol temple because we know there's no such thing as idols. We know those gods are false, and there's only one God. Well, Paul actually agrees with them about that point, that there are no such thing as idols. So in 1 Corinthians 8:4, he says, therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. So Paul actually agrees with them here on that point. Now look in 1 Corinthians 10, because he's going to elaborate a little further. In this section, Paul is not dealing with eating meat in the idol temple. He's dealing with the question, what if some of the leftover meat, and this happened all the time, by the way, what if some of the leftover meat that wasn't eaten in the temple the night before but was sacrificed to the idols, what if that meat is sold in the marketplace the next day? Can I buy that meat in the market and eat that meat? Look what Paul says about that. Verse 25 and 26. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience's sake, for the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. So in 1 Corinthians 8:4, Paul agrees there is no such thing as these other gods. And here he makes it clear that that's God's meat. That's not these false idols' meat at all. So to relate this to yoga, God is the one who created our bodies, not the Hindu gods. Hindu gods don't even exist. So for Hindus to own a monopoly on how we use our bodies, or to dictate that if we use our bodies and put our bodies in a certain position or posture, well, that must mean we're devoting ourselves to their false gods, that's just ridiculous. There's nothing inherently idolatrous about forming those yoga postures. In fact, most yoga today, especially in America, but Hindus would argue worldwide, is completely devoid of religion. On that same website from the Hindu Foundation, they said this: most of what is billed as yoga around the world is not the yoga described in the Yoga Sutras or any of the original texts. Rather, it has morphed into a form of asana. Asana just means postures, without faith, devotion, or the understanding underlying it, and therefore more akin to mere exercise. That's absolutely true. I have personally done yoga many times as a part of the P90X home fitness program. And in P90X, they cannot advertise yoga as a religion because obviously they'll be alienating an entire market of people. And so on those little DVDs with the yoga on it, Tony Horton, he's the man who kind of leads the workout, he'll even say, when they do ohms at the end, he'll even say, this is not a, quote, this is not a religion, it's just ohms. And then he says, the vibrations from the humming are soothing to the nervous system. So in other words, it's just a purely physical process. This has nothing to do with anything spiritual, becoming one with the universe or one with Brahman or any of that. It's clearly presented not as spiritual incantation, but just as physical exercise and relaxation today. So what that means is it is possible then to do yoga without it being devotion to Hindu gods. Secondly, unbelievers can't think you're doing it as a religion. This condition is harder to meet because you can't always control what people think. But if you are in a yoga class and it is clear that the instructor of that class is using spiritual language and presenting the class in a more traditional Hindu devotion sort of way, well, when everybody else in that class sees you participating in it, they'll assume you have the same beliefs. And that's not good. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul addresses a similar question in 1 Corinthians 10:27. The question he addresses here is, okay, what if an unbeliever invites me over for dinner? And the unbeliever who believes in those false gods sets down a piece of meat that he or she bought in the meat market. Can I eat it? Listen to what Paul says. Verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience's sake. But if anyone says to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it. Do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience's sake. I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Paul says you can eat the meat that was sacrificed to idols because you know that's really God's meat. And you know that there are no such things as idols. But if that unbeliever makes it a point to tell you that is meat that was sacrificed to idols, you don't eat it. And the reason is because if you do, that person's going to think you're eating it for the same reason they are, communing with their gods. Even though you may not intend that at all. That's what they're going to think that you're doing. And Paul understands. It seems absurd that we have to tiptoe around somebody else's conscience. He's kind of heading that off. Probably the Corinthians are thinking that. This is just absurd. Why in the world am I being judged for someone else's conscience? Well, because we need to think about that. We need to think about what the other person is thinking about us and the influence that we'll have on that person. So if the yoga class you take is presented as some spiritual exercise to commune with the God of the inner self or to become one with the universe, then non-Christians in the class are going to think that's what you're doing in that class. So I'm not taking that class, and you shouldn't either. Thirdly, it must not cause you, and I chose lust here. I'm going to make a point that's a little more generic in a second, but it must not cause you to lust. Look in 1 Corinthians 10, still earlier in the chapter, because Paul is still on the subject of idolatry. And notice what he tells them here. Verse 7, "Do not be idolaters as some of them were," talking about the Israelites. "As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day." And then if you drop down to verse 12, he says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." Now, in the context, Paul said earlier it was okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. But in the first part of this chapter, what he's doing is saying it's wrong to eat that meat in the idol temple. He warns them that if they get involved in that lifestyle, by hanging out in these idols' temples, they can get sucked into that idolatrous lifestyle. And I'll tell you, if you know anything about yoga classes, you know the men and especially the women are not dressed modestly. That is just a part of the yoga lifestyle and culture. And it makes sense because it's hard to do yoga with a floppy t-shirt on. It just is. When you're in those positions and your shirt rides up on you and smothers you in the face, or you're trying to bend your leg up somewhere and it's getting caught on your shirt and your arms are getting... It's just cumbersome to wear baggy clothing to do yoga. So I understand why the women are wearing the super tight clothing, but that is a serious danger zone for men. Especially combined with the fact that the women are often contorting themselves into very revealing positions because they're generally way more flexible than men are. In fact, isn't there kind of a running joke in our society about a man who signs up for a yoga class? Doesn't everybody know what's really going on there? That he's usually in there just to stare at the women. And I can say confidently that most Christian men will automatically be disqualified from being able to take a yoga class because of what the women are wearing and the modest positions they're standing in. It's going to be nearly impossible not to lust. And sadly, you're probably going to have a hard time finding an all-men's yoga class. I suppose you could, but it's going to be difficult. Whereas the women, right, if lust is a temptation for them in a mixed gender class, it's going to be much easier and much more practical for them to find an all-women's yoga class. Now remember, I said earlier I chose lust as a specific thing, but let's generalize that for just a second, because Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 10 isn't just about lust. He's making this general point about don't get sucked into the idolatrous culture and the world of idolatry. And I'll tell you, there's something else that you can get sucked into with yoga. You can get sucked into the lifestyle of inner peace through exercise instead of the greater peace that passes understanding in Jesus Christ. This happens to people all the time. We might think, well, that's just silly. That would never happen to me. That's absurd. What did Paul say? Take heed. Let him who thinks he stands be careful lest you fall. Happens to people all the time. I don't need Jesus. I have my inner peace. I have my yoga. I have my inner peace, my oneness through exercise. You can get sucked into that if you're not careful. And fourth and finally on this point, it must not cause another brother to sin or to stumble. Look in 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 8 verses 9 through 11. Back on this issue of eating meat, especially eating meat in the idol's temple, he says in 9 through 11, take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, and the brother for whose sake Christ died. So even if you somehow managed to find a yoga class that had absolutely nothing to do with religion and was presented as mere exercise, even if you found a class that wasn't a mixed gender class, so you wouldn't be tempted to lust, the truth is some Christians may still feel in their conscience that it is impossible for them to do yoga and feel like they're okay with God, or feel like they're not somehow involved in some sort of idolatrous practice. If that is the case, then we need to make sure we don't ever invite them to do yoga with us, and we don't need to be talking to them about how we went to yoga class and it was just so great and you should come too. We need to make sure we don't try to tell them to lighten up or to get over it and you're being too serious or too strict, but to respect that if it violates their conscience, we better not put anything in their way that would tempt them to violate their conscience. If these 4 conditions are met, it seems scripturally okay to do yoga. Question number 2 tonight. Are we to remember the Sabbath, though we worship on the first day of the week? And how is Jesus considered our Sabbath? Let's start in Colossians 2. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17. Paul is actually, let me set the context, combating a mixture of early Gnosticism and Judaism. And part of the Judaic element of the false teaching was that you have to submit to the law of Moses in order to be saved, including the laws about clean and unclean foods and the different festivals and the Sabbath law. Well, look what Paul says about that. Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Paul clearly says, don't let anybody judge you as sinful for not keeping the Sabbath day. Why is that? Well, he says because all those things in the law of Moses, including the Sabbath day, were just a shadow of what was to come. The Hebrew writer used similar language, and we don't have to turn there for now, but in Hebrews 10:1, when he talks about animal sacrifices. And he says there that those animal sacrifices in the law were really just a shadow of the good things to come. And he talks about that better sacrifice like we talked about in our sermon last Sunday morning, the better sacrifice of Jesus that fulfilled those animal sacrifices. So we don't keep the Sabbath for the same reason we don't offer animal sacrifices. There isn't any need to, because Jesus has given us a more perfect Sabbath rest. How so, though? Well, let me take you through a quick handful of passages, and I think you'll see this very clearly. Look in Genesis chapter 2, please. Genesis chapter 2, in verse 3. God, of course, creates the world in 6 days. He creates man on the 6th day, and then He rests on the 7th. And it says in verse 3, Genesis 2, verse 3, then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it He rested from all His work which God had created and made. Question, did God rest because He was tired? Of course not. So why in the world would God need to rest and to take this 7th day, what would be considered our Saturday? Why would He rest on this day? Well, I believe it makes perfect sense that He rests in order to enjoy His creation. He just creates the world in 6 days. His crowning creation was man and woman on day 6. And so He rests in order to enjoy and to be refreshed by the creation that He made. He can actually enjoy His relationship with Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve can enjoy their relationship with God. But here's my question. When did the ability for God to rest in man's presence end? And when did the ability for man to rest in God's presence end? Well, it ended when sin entered the world and destroyed that rest. Adam and Eve sinned, and we notice in Genesis 3, just ask yourself, do these passages sound like rest? Genesis 3:16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life, both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. And you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. And then verse 24, God drives them out of the garden, cuts them off from His presence because of their sin. See, because of sin, God could no longer enjoy perfect rest with man, and man could no longer enjoy perfect rest with God. God and man were estranged, and as a result, there was a restlessness in the world. Women are in pain to bring children into the world. Women are restless under the leadership of men because it is their desire to lead and control the man, but God says it'll be the other way around. Men are restless and in pain, toiling and laboring to make a living. There is enmity and hostility between God and man rather than peace and rest. However, what God did in the law of Moses is give the Israelites a taste of the rest they used to have with God before the toil and labor of work caused by sin. Did you look in Exodus 31? Exodus 31, verses 16 and 17. You see that. Look what God tells the Israelites about the Sabbath day in Exodus 31, 16 and 17. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day He ceased from labor and was refreshed. Notice, the Sabbath was a sign between God and the Israelites, not with any other nation. The Sabbath rest symbolized their special relationship with God, where they get to rest in His presence because they are His special people. To put it another way, the Sabbath was a once-a-week release from the punishment and burden of sin. It was a day in which they did not have to labor and toil by the sweat of their brow. They did not have to experience the painful curse of sin that day. Instead, it was supposed to be a day of focusing on the Lord, not having to work, remembering what God has done for them, and being in relationship with Him. So how does Jesus fulfill the Sabbath? Well, Jesus fulfills the Sabbath by giving us a permanent rest from the punishment and curse of sin. Look in Matthew 11. Matthew 11, please. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 11. We just sung a song about this morning. 28 through 30. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, the Sabbath day under the law of Moses only provided physical rest. Jesus provides spiritual rest. The Sabbath day under the law of Moses was only meant to symbolize and remind people of the fellowship and relationship that they had with God before sin entered the world with Adam and Eve. But Jesus actually restores that relationship before sin entered. He restores our fellowship with God. The Sabbath day under the law of Moses was only once a week. The rest Jesus provides is every day of the week. The Sabbath day under the law of Moses only provided rest in this life. Jesus provides us rest every day in this life and into all eternity. This is what makes it so ridiculous in the following verses in Matthew 12, when the Pharisees question Jesus about breaking the Sabbath. They're accusing the fulfillment of the Sabbath of not really understanding or respecting the Sabbath. How absurd. That's why Jesus tells them in Matthew 12 and verse 8, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He's Lord of the Sabbath not only because He created the Sabbath with God, but He fulfills the Sabbath. And because of what Jesus has done for us and dying for us on the cross, the Hebrew writer could say in Hebrews 4:9, there yet remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. He says that the ultimate Sabbath rest will be in heaven, when we're back in God's presence the way Adam and Eve were in the very beginning. And that is only made possible through Jesus. So the question naturally would be, why in the world would we go back to submitting ourselves to keeping the Sabbath day when we have something so much better in Christ? And I want to give you a bonus thought about this, because we have many Seventh-day Adventist believers in this area. And they firmly believe that we still have to, as Christians, keep the Sabbath day. It's why whenever you pass by a Seventh-day Adventist building, their parking lot is full on Saturdays, because they're still worshiping on Saturday and not on Sundays. And I want you to know the main argument that they make for why we should still keep the Sabbath day. They take the verse in Genesis 2:3 and they say, this is when God instituted the Sabbath day. This is when God gave His Sabbath law, is in Genesis 2:3. He gave it to Adam and Eve. This is the argument. He gave it to Adam and Eve before the law of Moses was around. So even though we're no longer under the law of Moses today, they would argue that we're still bound by the Sabbath day because that was a universal law for all of mankind, not just the Israelites under the law of Moses. And so the law of Moses has been done away with, but the Sabbath day from the very beginning in Genesis 2 still applies to us today. But in just the verses that we read, I hope that you see the glaring problems with that. Several problems to consider. First of all, why would God command Adam and Eve to rest on the seventh day before sin entered the world? Yes, man was told to tend the garden, but you don't really get the impression that things were toilsome and full of heavy labor in the garden before sin. So why would they need that rest when they're already at rest with God? Secondly, if God instituted the Sabbath day in Genesis 2, how can we never read about any of the patriarchs keeping it in Genesis? We never see Abel keeping it. You never see Noah keeping the Sabbath. You never see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and so forth. Thirdly, Paul the Apostle said in Colossians 2 that we read earlier, the Sabbath day was not to be bound on Christians because, and he lumped it together with the other law of Moses regulations. And fourthly, Nehemiah tells us very clearly that God did not institute the Sabbath law until He did it through Moses. Would you look at Nehemiah 9:14? Nehemiah 9:14. It's a very, very difficult verse. I've not had any Seventh-day Adventists be able to really answer this verse. They give you an answer, but it really ignores what's the verse is saying here. Nehemiah is reminding the people of their history. Just very nonchalantly mentions this in verse 14. But he says to God in prayer, okay, you made known to them your holy Sabbath and laid down for them commandments, statutes, and law through your servant Moses. God didn't reveal His law about keeping the Sabbath until Moses came, which is also why He said in Exodus 31 that the Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel and not the whole world. The Sabbath law was never a universal law bound on all mankind since the beginning. It was only given to the Israelites through Moses. And now that Jesus has fulfilled it, we no longer need to keep it. We worship on Sunday now because that's the day that Jesus rose from the dead. He rose from the grave on the first day of the week. The first day of the week, Sunday, is also the day that the church was first established in Acts chapter 2. The first day of the week is when the book of Acts tells us that the brethren met for worship. Acts chapter 20, verse 7. And there are all kinds of writings outside the Bible from the earliest Christians that say over and over again that they met and worshiped on the first day of the week and not on the Sabbath day. Final question tonight. At what point do you determine whether to leave a spiritually toxic work environment? At what point do you determine whether to leave a spiritually toxic work environment? Well, it depends what you mean by spiritually toxic. If by that you mean it's not spiritually encouraging to you, or it's discouraging to see all the sin around you, that's going to be really hard to avoid in this world. It's going to be hard to find coworkers who are spiritually encouraging to you because in general we live in a culture of unbelief and sin, and so it's going to be nearly impossible to avoid working with people who have morals that don't match the morals of Jesus Christ. And Paul makes that point in 1 Corinthians 5, 9 and 10 that look, if you don't want to associate with any evil people, with any immoral people, you're going to have to leave the world because evil people are all around us. We're guilty of sin as well, but there are people around us that don't care about the Lord, and we see that everywhere. But you know what? God's plan for us is not to isolate ourselves from people in the world, but instead to shine our light in the darkness and influence people to live for the Lord. If you want to know how to do that more effectively, I encourage you to listen to the class I'm teaching on evangelism online. But if you're surrounded by darkness at work and you leave, how much more in darkness are those people going to be? Because the only light that was there just left. Don't isolate, illuminate. If, though, on the other hand, by spiritually toxic you mean it's actually starting to weaken your faith and corrode your convictions, poison your morals, then it may be time to move on. If rather than shining your Christian light, you feel like they're smothering your light with darkness and starting to influence you in a sinful direction, it may be time to get out of there. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good morals. Proverbs 22 and verse 3, the prudent sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive goes on and are punished for it. Some jobs and job settings are just not compatible with Christianity. You know, we might find ourselves making good money, but in bad ways. We might find ourselves attracted to someone at work, and even though we're married, this person is very flirtatious and attractive, and so we're having a hard time staying strong against that temptation. We might find ourselves working with people who don't respect our faith, and they're just mocking and belittling us, and it's just wearing on us over time, and they're pressuring us to do wrong things like they're doing just to make themselves feel better. If this work environment is genuinely toxic to you spiritually, and you're being corrupted in some way, and it seems like no matter what you do to try to strengthen yourself in God's Word and in prayer and in worship service and with your brethren, and you still feel yourself getting pulled into the sin around you, God's Word would say, get out of there. And I'll tell you, that would be scary. Because you're probably thinking, if I leave, it might be a long time before I find another job. Maybe I don't find another job. Maybe I have to change careers, and I don't know if I'm prepared to change careers, and I got to make money, and I won't have a source of income for a while, and that's scary. But you know you need your soul more than you need the money. And I firmly believe that if you take a stand for God and for what is right, He will take care of you. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these other things will be added unto you. Would you take out your songbooks, please? Do you want to know the peace that passes all understanding? Jesus tells you exactly how to do it. Jesus says, come to me. I will give you rest. Won't you come to Him tonight, believing that He's the Lord, being baptized into Him for the forgiveness of your sins, in repentance, and confessing Him as Lord? If you've already done that, you've wandered off, or you've tried to find peace in other ways, maybe through yoga, maybe through vacationing, maybe through travel, maybe through whatever, books, movies, whatever it is you have tried to find a counterfeit peace through. Won't you realize tonight that there is only peace in the Prince of Peace, Jesus our Lord? If we can help you put your faith in Him and come to Him tonight, come forward and let us know while we stand and sing.
Would you bring from the